Happy Tuesday. Chapter 24, Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. The nut room, it said on the next door they came to. All right, said Mr. Wonka, stop here for a moment and catch your breath, and take a peek through the glass panel of this door, but don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the nut room. If you go in, you'll scare the squirrels. Everyone crowded round the door. Oh, look, Grandpa, look, cried Charlie. Squirrels, shouted Veruca Salt. Crikey, said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table, and on the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. These squirrels are specifically trained for getting nuts out of walnuts, said Mr. Wonka. Why use squirrels? Asked Mike TV. Why not use Oompa Loompas? Because, said Mr. Wonka, Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of a walnut shell every time. It is extremely difficult, but in my factory I insist upon only whole nuts. Therefore, I have to have squirrels to do the job. Aren't they wonderful? The way that they get those nuts out and see how they tap each walnut with their knuckles to make sure it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the rubbish chute. Look, there. Watch one squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one now. They all watched the little squirrel as he tapped on the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening attentively. Then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole on the floor. Hey, Mummy, shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels. Don't be silly, sweetheart, said Mrs. Salt. These all belong to Mr. Wonka. I don't care about that, shouted Veruca. I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs, 4 cats, and 6 bunny rabbits, 2 parakeets, 3 canaries, a green parrot, a turtle, and a bowl of goldfish, and a cage of white mice, and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel. All right, my pet, Mrs. Salt said soothingly. Mummy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can. But I don't want any old squirrel, Veruca shouted. I want a trained squirrel. At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. Very well, Wonka, he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. How much do you want for one of these squirrels? Name your price. They're not for sale, Mr. Wonka answered. She can't have one. Who says I can't? Shouted Veruca. I'm going to get one myself this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with their small, beady black eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. All right, Veruca said, I'll have you. She reached out her hands to grab a squirrel, but as she did, in that first split second when her hand started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg, and the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, clambered up onto her shoulders and started tapping on the wretched girl's head with her knuckles. Save her, screamed Mrs. Salt. Veruca, come back, what are they doing to her? Well, they're testing her to see if she's a bad nut, said Mr. Wonka. You watch. Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tap, tap, tap on the side of her head with his knuckles. Then all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. My goodness, she is a bad nut after all, said Mr. Wonka. Her head must have sounded quite hollow. Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny strong paws held her tightly, and she couldn't escape. Where are they taking her? Shrieked Mrs. Salt. Well, she's going where all the other bad nuts go, said Mr. Willy Wonka. Down the rubbish chute. Oh, by golly, she is going down the rubbish chute, said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door. Then save her, said Mrs. Salt. It's too late, said Wonka. She's gone. And indeed she had. But where? Screamed Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. What happened to the bad nuts? Where did they take her? That particular chute, Mr. Wonka told her, runs directly into the great big main rubbish pipe, which carries all the rubbish from every part of the factory, all the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotting cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that. Who eats fish heads and cabbages and potatoes in this factory? I'd like to know that, said Mike TV. I do, of course. You don't think I live on beans, do you? But, said Mrs. Salt, where does the great big pipe go to in the end? Well, why, to the furnace, of course, Mr. Wonka said. To the incinerator. Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. Don't worry, said Mr. Wonka. There's always a chance they've decided not to light it today. A chance, yelled Mrs. Salt. My Veruca, darling, she'll be sizzled like a sausage. Quite right, my dear. Now see here, Wonka, Mr. Salt added. I think you're just gone a shade too far this time, I do indeed. My daughter may just be a bit of a frump, I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this, I really am. But don't be cross, my dear sir, said Mr. Wonka. I'll expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She may not have even gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole, and if that's the case, all you'll have to do is go in and pull her out. Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. Veruca, shouted Mrs. Salt, are you down there? There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further down to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. Good gracious me, cried Mr. Salt as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hole. What a lot of rubbish that's going down there today. He saw her disappearing into the darkness. What's it like down there, Angina? He called out. He leaned further forward. The squirrels rushed up behind him. Help, he shouted, but he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. Oh dear, cried Charlie, who was watching through with the others through the side of the door. What's going to happen to them now? I bet someone will catch him at the bottom of the chute, said Mr. Wonka. But what about the great fiery incinerator? Asked Charlie. They only light it every other day, said Mr. Wonka. Perhaps it's one of the days where they let it go out. You never know, they might be lucky. Shh, said Grandpa Joe. Listen, here comes another song. Far away from down the corridor came the beating of drums, then the singing began. Veruca Salt, sang the Oompa Loompas. Veruca Salt, the little brew, has just gone down the rubbish chute, and we were very rightly thought that in this case that in a case like this we ought to see the thing completely through. We've polished off her parents too. Down goes Veruca down the drain, and perhaps we should explain that she will meet as she descends a rather set of different friends. To those she has left behind, these won't be nearly so refined. A fish head, for example, cut from this morning's halibut. Hello, good morning, how do you do? How nice to meet you, how are you? And then a little further down, a mass of others gather round. A bacon rinds, some rancher's lard, a loaf of bread gone stale and hard. A steak that nobody could chew, an oyster from an oyster's shoe. Some liverwurst so old and grey, one smelled it from a mile away. A rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left on the stair, and lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell. These are Veruca's new-found friends, that she will meet as she descends, and this is the price that she has to pay for going so very far astray. But now, my dears, we think you might, by wondering, is this really right? That every single bit of blame, and all the scolding and the shame should fall upon Veruca Salt? Is she the only one at fault? For though she spoiled them dreadfully so, a girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need? Who turned her into such a brat? Who are the culprits? Who did that? Alas, you needn't look so far to find out who these sinners are. They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, mum and dad, and that's why we're glad they fell into the rubbish chute as well.